Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. Michael Matt for the Remnant Forum. Well, it's beginning to happen all over again. When confronted with principled defense of the Catholic faith and the infallibly defined dogmas of the faith, moral theology, and the rest on the part of 4 cardinals of the Catholic Church, our poor, benighted neo-Catholic friends have set up firing squads now all over the internet going after who, you guessed it, the messenger. Cardinal Burke is the problem. Not dear Pope Francis the Humble, who's just trying to be merciful to public adulterers. No, it's Cardinal Burke who's the problem. And his fellow cardinals, bishops, and a growing list of priests who are now on board as well, admitting that something has gone terribly wrong in the pontificate of Pope Francis. So here we go again, the classic case of shooting the messenger. Pope Francis isn't changing anything. He's just trying to be merciful and accommodate good Catholics in these difficult situations that we're in. So what we want to do today is get right down to brass tacks on this case, which really is threatening to divide the entire Catholic Church in a way that is akin to the great Arian Crisis of the 4th century. We have Cardinal Burke admitting that, Bishop Athanasius Schneider admitting that yes, this has the gravitas, the seriousness, to become another Arian crisis. We want to get right down to brass tacks. What's going on? First off, let's just get this out of the way. Much of what Pope Francis's synodal exhortation says, Amoris Laetitia, much of it is just fine. It's solid Catholic teaching on marriage, family, and love, and so forth. But modernists, and liberals have always and forever, they've always done this. They couch errors in sound doctrine and hope nobody notices. Now, one of the most controversial paragraphs in Amoris Laetitia is paragraph 305. We haven't had Chris Ferrara down here for a while in the Remnant Forum, so I want to bring Chris in and get his opinion on some of this. And let's go into the heart of this history-changing controversy. We're just going to get right into it, have a conversation about some of these aspects of Amoris Laetitia. Chris, are you there?
I'm here, and, with respect to Amoris Laetitia, the problematic section isn't just 305, it's 302 through 305, and in particular, what I'm going to focus on in our brief discussion today, paragraph 303. But let's have a reality check. It is not possible, full stop, to admit to Holy Communion, full stop, people living in objectively adulterous relationships. Full stop. It doesn't matter what their subjective disposition might be. As the CDF said in 2000 in an instruction on this matter, about the 3rd or 4th time the Vatican had shot down the Casper proposal, it is intrinsically impossible for people living in adulterous situations, in this case the so-called divorced and remarried, to receive Holy Communion. And as the CDF said on that occasion, and I quote, "If the prior marriage of 2 divorced and remarried members of the faithful was valid, under no circumstances can their new union be considered lawful, and therefore reception of the sacraments is intrinsically impossible. The conscience of the individual is bound to this norm without exception."
Yeah.
Without exception. That is the teaching of the Church. In Familiaris Consortio, back in 1984, it's time for a reality check to remember the vanishing magisterium that they're trying to make disappear through a magic trick. John Paul II said, "The Church reaffirms her practice, which is based on sacred scripture, not just canon law or some sort of ephemeral ecclesiastical discipline, but sacred scripture, of not admitting to Eucharistic communion divorced persons who have remarried. They are unable to be admitted thereto from the fact that their state and condition in life objectively contradict that union of love between Christ and the Church, which is signified and effected by the Eucharist." Objectively, it doesn't matter what they claim their subjective disposition is. He goes on to say, therefore, in Familiaris, reconciliation and the sacrament of penance, which would open the way to the Eucharist, can only be granted to those who, repented of having broken the sign of the covenant and our fidelity to Christ, are sincerely ready to undertake a way of life that is no longer in contradiction to the indissolubility of marriage. This means that when, for serious reasons, such as, for example, the children's upbringing, a man and a woman cannot satisfy the obligation to separate, they take on themselves the duty to live in complete continence, that is, by abstinence from the acts proper to married couples. In other words, the teaching of the Church reaffirmed by John Paul II and by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith under his authority, is simply that it is impossible for people living in so-called second marriages, which are objectively adulterous relations, in the absence of an amendment of life, to receive Holy Communion. They must refrain from further adultery, just like any mortal sinner must refrain from any continually committed mortal sin, whatever it is, whether it's the sin of onan, the sin of viewing pornography, the sin of cohabitation. There must be an amendment of life and a commitment to refrain from that activity before one can be absolved and admitted to Holy Communion. That is the basic teaching of the Catholic Church, in light of the fact that the divine precept, thou shalt not commit adultery, is exceptionless. There are no exceptions to it. Sexual relations outside of marriage can never, under any circumstances, be permitted or justified. That's it. That's the teaching of the Church.
The problem is the Francis defenders are going to say, yeah, of course, Pope Francis absolutely agrees with that. Everything you just said he agrees with. But what he's trying to do is take into account broken understanding, broken catechesis, broken lives, people that don't understand anything about the indissolubility of marriage. And he's trying to reach out to them. He's trying to bring them in. They made mistakes a long time ago. And so he says in Amoris Laetitia in 305, quote, a pastor cannot feel that it is enough to simply apply moral laws to those living in irregular situations, as if they were stones to throw at people's lives. This would bespeak the closed heart of one used to hiding behind the Church's teaching, sitting in the chair of Moses and judging at times with superiority and superficiality difficult cases and wounded families. End quote, Chris. This is working. People are saying, yeah, there are a lot of wounded families out there. Cardinal Burke doesn't care about them at all. He just wants to stick to old intransigent rules and let everybody just go to hell. What do you say to that?
In other words, he wants to stick to the negative precepts of the natural law, thou shalt not commit adultery, which admits of no exception. He wants to stick to the constant teaching of the Church. He wants to stick to the teaching of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, both of whom insisted that the admission of people living in adulterous relations is intrinsically impossible. He wants to stick to the teaching of the Church. This is lunacy. What you just read is cheap demagoguery. How dare anyone who sits on the throne of Peter call enforcement of the divine law by the pastors of the Church with due charity and counseling of people who are in these situations? How dare he call that throwing stones at people, as if enforcing the moral precept that Christ laid down without exception is like throwing the stones that the Pharisees threw at people who committed adultery. This is absolutely monstrous, cheap demagoguery. That's all it is.
But what's so terrifying about this is that, for 100 and so years, Pope Pius X warned us 100 years ago about the development, or the evolution, I should say, of doctrine. And what you have is an evolution of morality now. You have people all over the place who are saying, I got sisters who are divorced, I got brothers who are divorced, I got kids who are gay, I got all these realistic, real-world problems. And Cardinal Burke just wants to stand up there and say there's nothing that anyone can do for my sister, my brother, my kids, because the law is the law. And I think that's what Pope Francis is capitalizing on.
Yeah, but that's where the demagoguery comes in, because what Francis is really saying, when you strip away all the flowery verbiage and simulated piety, is that you don't have to follow the moral law if it's really tough. That's what he's saying. No pope has ever taught any such nonsense. The whole point of divine grace in assisting our actions is to make it possible to carry the burden of fulfilling the commandments. And the burden is light and the yoke is easy, said our Lord, if we appeal to divine grace. Of course you may fall, you may commit a mortal sin, but then you have to go to confession, confess your sin, receive absolution, on the understanding that you will amend your life and not sin again. That's the teaching of the Church. There's nothing more fundamental. Which brings us to the dubia of the five cardinals. They look at, in particular, paragraph 303 of Amoris Laetitia. And paragraph 303 of Amoris Laetitia simply destroys the moral law in practice. Here's what paragraph 303 says. Naturally, every effort should be made to encourage the development of an enlightened conscience, formed and guided by the responsible and serious discernment of one's pastor, and to encourage an ever greater trust in God's grace. That's the end of it right there. But he goes further. Yet, There is no yet, but he inserts a yet into the constant teaching of the church. Yet conscience can do more than recognize that a given situation does not correspond objectively to the overall demands of the gospel. No, conscience can't do more than that. Once conscience recognizes that, conscience must follow it, if conscience is well formed. But Francis says, and I quote, "Conscience can also recognize with sincerity and honesty what for now is the most generous response which can be given to God, and come to see with a certain moral security that it is what God himself is asking amid the concrete complexity of one's limits, while not yet fully the objective ideal." He's reduced the moral law to an ideal, and you do the best you can, and God accepts this. No, he doesn't. That has never been the teaching of the church. And that is why, in their 5 dubia number 5, referring specifically to the paragraph I just read, asks this question of the Roman pontiff. After Amoris Laetitia, paragraph 303, does one still need to regard as valid the teaching of St. John Paul II's encyclical Veritatis Splendor, based on sacred scripture and the tradition of the church, that excludes a creative interpretation of the role of conscience, and that emphasizes that conscience can never be authorized to legitimate exceptions to absolute moral norms that prohibit intrinsically evil acts by virtue of their object? They're actually asking the Roman pontiff if he still expects us to believe that there are moral laws to which there can be no exceptions created by conscience. They're asking the Pope whether he is adhering to the foundation of Catholic adherence to the moral order. It's unbelievable that a Pope has to be asked that question.
Yeah, it is. But again, people have already thrown Cardinal Burke under the bus. He's just a troublemaker. So I don't. For a moment, let's back up and let's look at footnote 351 once again, because again, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. People don't understand this. They haven't read Amoris Laetitia. They don't believe the interpretations. And we get this all the time on Facebook and elsewhere. I'm so tired of the media spin. Pope Francis is changing nothing, blah, blah, blah. So I want to get your opinion on this most controversial paragraph, footnote, which shows up in paragraph 305 of Amoris Laetitia, the synodal exhortation of Pope Francis, and it says the following. This footnote seems to suggest that remarried, I think it does more than seem, but let's leave it at seems to suggest that remarried couples whose first marriages have not been annulled can receive communion, which the Catholic Church has always regarded as sacrilege, because without an annulment, and we're going to talk about annulments in a few minutes too, because the easy annulment thing is what predicated all this. But in any case, the relationship is adulterous, and so objectively sinful, and thus barring reception of communion. So here's the footnote, Chris, and I want you to comment on it. 351, quote, "In certain cases, this can include the help of the sacraments. Hence, I want to remind priests that the confessional must not be a torture chamber, but rather an encounter with the Lord's mercy," which is Evangelium Gaudium 24 from November 2013. "I would also point out that the Eucharist is not a prize for the perfect, but a powerful medicine and nourishment for the weak." That's footnote 351, end quote. Chris, what's he getting at here?
It's more cheap demagoguery. Who said the confession is a torture chamber? The confessional is the place where you confess your sin and you make a firm purpose of amendment, and with the guidance of the priest, who gives you a penance and tells you how to correct your situation, you vow not to commit it again. And if you fail in that commitment, as long as the commitment was legitimate and you weren't feigning your firm purpose of amendment, you can be absolved again if you fall again. What he's saying here is that this is no longer necessary. You do the best you can, and the priest gives you absolution while you continue to live in adultery. Well, this is monstrous, and we don't have to argue about whether this is what Francis intends. He said that's what he intends in his letter to the bishops of Buenos Aires in response to their so-called guidelines for implementing Amoris, which guidelines, by the way, he solicited so he could comment on them. Here's their guideline. Guidelines number 5 and 6. Whenever feasible, say the bishops of Buenos Aires, depending on the specific circumstances of a couple, a proposal may be made to resolve to live in continence. Amoris Laetitia does not ignore the difficulties arising from this option. It's not an option. If a couple, through circumstances they cannot overcome, such as the presence of children, have to provide a home for these children, to give the obvious example, then they have to do so on the understanding that they will refrain from continued adulterous sexual relations. It's not an option. If they're going to remain together for the sake of children, because there's no other way out, they have to refrain from sexual relations. There is no option involved. They have to make that commitment. That is what John Paul II teaches. You're going to throw the Pope under the bus now? Frogs, you're being boiled. But then the bishops go on to say, in Buenos Aires, in paragraph 6 of their so-called guidelines, in more complex cases. What does that mean, in more complex cases? How complex? In more complex cases, and when a declaration of nullity has not been obtained, in other words, in the eyes of the Church, the prior marriage is still valid, the above-mentioned option may not, in fact, be feasible. What do you mean it might not be feasible? Since when is feasibility a part of the moral calculus that Catholics have to go through when they decide whether their actions are going to be moral or immoral? There is no feasibility calculus in Catholic morality, or indeed in any morality worthy of the name. The natural law applies whether or not you think it's feasible. He's saying here, through these bishops, who are really his meat puppets, to use a term from WikiLeaks, they're saying what he wants them to say. They're saying that if it isn't feasible for you to follow the moral law, then you're entitled to an exemption from it. They go on to say, nonetheless, a path of discernment is still possible. If it is acknowledged that in a concrete case, what do you mean all cases are concrete? In a concrete case, there are limitations that mitigate responsibility and culpability, especially when a person believes he or she would incur a subsequent fault by harming the children. Amoris Laetitia offers the possibility of having access to the sacraments of reconciliation and Eucharist. In other words, they're saying, A, if there is no annulment, and B, you have a complex case, C, you can go on committing adultery in your so-called second marriage and still receive the sacraments of reconciliation and the Eucharist. And what did Francis say in response to these guidelines in his letter to the bishops of Buenos Aires? He said, there is no other interpretation. So he said privately, in a letter that was obviously intended to be leaked and published to the world, that this is what he wants. There's no way around it. And that's why the 5 cardinals have posited their 5 dubia, or 5 questions to the Pope, the 5th of which basically asks the Pope, hey, are you overthrowing the moral law in its application in the Church?
Yeah, it's as I'm listening to Chris. I mean, this is such a huge problem that I don't even. I wanted to do this show in order to shed some, offer some clarity on this issue, but it's so difficult. I mean, let's face it. Part of the reason people are so confused, and maybe a lot of people are amenable to what Francis is suggesting here, is because of the culture of easy annulment, de facto Catholic divorce. Do you know what most people say? Most like neo-Catholic types that I've talked to about this, their criticism of what the Pope is doing is they're saying, why is he allowing for these people to receive sacraments after when they're divorced and remarried? Why can't they just go get their annulments like I did? I mean, everybody is talking this way now. What's the problem? Just go get your annulment. That's what I did. That's what my brother did.
That's what's so insidious about this. Now we're being told it's not even necessary to get the quickie annulment.
Yeah.
Essentially, the second marriage is being treated as if it were marriage. Now, one of the defenders of this nonsense has said, well, he's not allowing all of these people engaged in objective public adultery to receive Holy Communion. Just some of them. Really? Which ones? Yeah. Joseph Seifert, the Austrian philosopher, said, well, this is absurd. How do you apply this in practice? You say to Joe, well, you're a good adulterer because you have a complex case, so you can receive Holy Communion. But then you say to Sam, sorry, Sam, you don't have enough complexity in your case. You're a bad adulterer. You can't receive Holy Communion. I mean, apply this to other sins. If you say that feasibility or difficulty of obedience now excuses, in certain cases, compliance with negative precepts of the natural law, thou shalt not commit adultery goes out the window, is to all kinds of different situations, including those who habitually commit the sin of self-abuse, those who are shacked up, those who are engaged in homosexual unions. And why stop at sexual sins? How about someone who is a hitman for the mafia? If he doesn't keep committing these hits, they're going to do a hit on him. So he goes to his confessor and says, what am I going to do? If I don't kill Joe, they're going to kill me. And there's no way I can stop doing this. Oh, fine. But then it's not feasible for you. How about other sins? Like all the sins that Francis condemns on the part of greedy rich people who are making profits through illicit arms trade, for example. The arms trader says, my wife and my children, they would be without a livelihood. I would lose everything. And I'm under pressure, too, from my employer. And he's going to fire me. I'll be destroyed if I don't keep doing this. It's not feasible for me in my concrete circumstances, in my complex case. Or how about the environmental sins that he's constantly condemning? It isn't feasible for me to recycle my refuse. I recycle my refuse, it's going to be a grave inconvenience. And I just can't see my way clear to doing that. Oh, no problem, my son. You receive absolution from the newly invented sin, by the way, of environmental pollution. I mean, the application of this nonsensical exception based on feasibility and complexity knows no limitations. You can't just confine it to the case of some of the divorced and remarried. This is an H-bomb dropped upon the moral edifice of the church. And that's why the cardinals have published their dubia. They know what's at stake here. Again, I say to you, frogs, you're being boiled. Jump out of the pot. You can't accept this.
And to act as though this is going to stay right here. I mean, essentially what we're looking at, Chris, when Francis talks about these people in exceptional situations, what does that sound like? Doesn't it sound like rape and incest when it comes to abortion? Abortion is bad, 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 except in those exceptional cases of rape and incest. So it's the same liberal mentality, but where do you think this is going to go? Do these people actually think it's going to stop with the exceptional cases and the folks in difficult situations? Of course not. Because I can say to you, well, you got yours, I want mine now. I want to be able to go to the sacraments just like you do.
Mike, it's even worse than the rape and incest exceptions to abortion. There you have a crime against the natural law, an exceptionalist norm, thou shalt not kill. Abortion violates that. There are no exceptions, yet some people create two exceptions. Rape and incest for those two hard cases. Here we don't have any criteria for the exception. The exception is certain cases, which are complex. It would be like saying you can commit abortion in certain cases. In your complex reality of life, you might be entitled to commit an abortion. If you can say that adultery is excusable in complex circumstances, then why not abortion in any set of complex circumstances? Not just rape and incest. That's how pernicious this is. That's why these 5 cardinals have been forced to go public to ask the Pope, basically, excuse us, but we have to ask you politely, have you destroyed the moral order in practice? This is not pastoral solicitude or mercy. This is recklessness.
No, absolutely. And the folks are not, everybody's always thinking about me, how it impacts me. And that poor little Oprah Winfrey case, what about that little 17 and 18-year-old that got married years ago and now they want to do the right thing and come back to the sacraments and all that? Okay, so let's just take that just one step further then. We're supposed to do this, allow them to receive the sacraments for the good of the children. They got to stay together and all this. And that really works with the bleeding heart liberals. But what about those children? What about the fact that they are now growing up in a household that from their earliest recollections, they were cognizant of the fact that dad had been married before. And he had left his wife for whatever reason, and now he's married to mom. He grows up in a climate or an environment of adultery, and it's approved by the church. What is that young man going to do when he's 21, 22 years old? What's his position going to be on the indissolubility of marriage? Growing up like that.
You're showing that the implications of this are almost endless. And this idea that, well, if you have a really hard case, you don't have to comply with the moral law just yet. For now, this is the best response. If you do that in response to that particular hard case, guess what? As you've just indicated, you create a hard case for somebody else. You create a hard case for the first spouse, the validly married spouse, who now sees his wife being allowed to receive Holy Communion while he has to sit there and watch it. And he has lived chastely in accordance with the teaching of the church, making that sacrifice, never remarrying, and now he's in a hard case. What is he supposed to do? Well, I guess he'll just pick up with another woman and marry since they let his wife get away with it. He should do the same. And then if you let him do that, then the children of that union are born to someone who is engaging in sexual relations outside of marriage, and they grow up accepting the idea that you can have more than one wife. So the hard cases that you create by exempting one hard case multiply down through the generations. That's why there is no exception, as difficult as it may be for some people, to a negative precept of the natural law. You can't create an exception in certain cases without destroying the precept in practice.
No, it's just that sinister, and it's more than a can of worms. It's more than a slippery slope. It's a cliff, you know. But Chris, I can already hear the yeah buts. Francis has said so many beautiful things in defense of marriage. We're getting a little short on time. I don't want to read you this quote. This comes right out of Amoris Laetitia as well. Now you're Jesuit trained, so maybe you can parse this for us, because this is the Jesuit modernist at work. Listen to it. On its face, it sounds quite beautiful. Francis says, quote, "In order to avoid all misunderstanding, I would point out that in no way must the Church desist from proposing the full ideal of marriage, God's plan in all of its grandeur. Young people who are baptized should be encouraged to understand that the sacrament of marriage can enrich their prospects of love, and that they can be sustained by the grace of Christ in the sacrament and by the possibility of participating fully in the life of the Church. A lukewarm attitude," says Francis, "any kind of relativism or an undue reticence in proposing that ideal would be a lack of fidelity to the gospel and also of love on the part of the Church for young people themselves. To show understanding in the face of exceptional situations never implies dimming the light of the fuller ideal or proposing less than what Jesus offers to the human being."
Unbelievable. He's doing precisely the thing he denies doing. He reduces marriage to an ideal. He reduces the institution of holy matrimony to an offer from God. He says that it can enrich you. It would enrich you. Subjunctive tense.
Yeah.
This is just unbelievable. It isn't something that Christ offers. He commands it. He says that only in marriage, without exception, can one engage in relations that are ordered to procreation and the rearing of children. It's not an offer. It's not a proposal. It's not an ideal that can enrich you. It is the only way that you can be enriched in the engagement with another in sexual relations that produce eternal souls. That is the only way to go about this. Yeah. Holy matrimony was designed for the exclusive practice of marital relations, for the exclusive purpose of bringing souls into the world, filling up the number of the elect, rearing them, and bringing them to their eternal destiny. He reduces it to a gauzy ideal that can be very fulfilling. Yeah. This is seditious, modernist verbiage that denies the very thing it is purporting to affirm with clever, ambiguous, subjunctive tense language.
And because, let's face it, because Catholics have been so dumbed down, this is the kind of language that they listen to and they hear and they say, oh, that's beautiful. Obviously, Cardinal Burke and company are all wrong. And Chris, the other thing that he's been doing for so long is he keeps insulting what he calls sort of rigid people, the rigorous, and those who are rigid in their application of the law. And what we just saw here and what you're talking about now is not being rigid. We're not going to be rigid. That's a bad thing. That's part of the past now. We are going to be loving. And I am a humble pope. I will show you how to be humble and to bring people closer to Jesus. Chris, this, whether we like it or not, this is incredibly seductive for the vast majority of Catholics who still bother going to church on Sunday.
Well, God is rigid by that standard when he says, thou shalt not commit adultery. Jesus Christ, God incarnate, is rigid by that standard when he says, whoever puts away his wife and marries another committeth adultery. Whoever. No exceptions. No discussion of complex limitations. No pastoral cop-outs for people who find it really, really difficult not to marry another when they've put away their wives. Our Lord is rigid by this standard. God is rigid by this standard. The commandments are rigid. This is seductive, devastating nonsense. Yeah, and that is why, again, I hate to keep harping on this, that is why these 5 cardinals have come forward to ask the Pope questions which they say go to the foundations of the Christian life. It isn't just about a practical application to people in these situations of being divorced and remarried. It involves the moral law in general, the application of negative precepts of the natural law in general, and therefore the entire moral edifice of the Catholic Church. That's what's at stake here. These cardinals are not fools. They're not schismatics. They're not quibblers. They're not Pharisees. They're defending the foundations of our faith. Anybody who doesn't see this, anybody who gets suckered by this flowery pseudo-pastoral language is the frog being boiled alive in the pot. That's what's going on here. Jump out of the pot, again I say. Jump out of the pot, you're being boiled alive very slowly.
Yeah, you think about marriage, it's always been understood, the nucleus of society, and this is an assault on marriage. Whether, let's say for a second, it's all very on the up and up, and Francis is just trying to help people. It ends up undermining marriage. And what you used to have in the old church is if you made a mistake and you married some spent piece of used jet trash that was, just a terrible person, guess what? You got stuck with that. And it was the fact that you were potentially stuck, married to someone who didn't share your faith or didn't share your sense of humor or whatever. You became incompatible. Life was understood to be very difficult. Contempt would come up with the sun. So make sure you do the right thing, young people, when you're going to get married. Choose the right person. Pray about it. Make sure you're going to be compatible. Because if you don't, you're out of luck. There is no second chance. And what did that do, Chris? That strengthened the institution of marriage. People were simply out of luck if they chose badly. But now
but you have to say this though. With God's grace, there always is a second chance. So you marry somebody who's unsuitable, okay? You realize you've made a mistake, but you both consented. It's a valid marriage. And so in one sense you made a mistake, in another sense you didn't, because it's an indissoluble sacramental bond. So you pray for the assistance of divine grace. You persevere in that prayer. You make an amendment of life. You don't remarry. And maybe the woman that became a bad spouse becomes a good spouse. And there's your second chance. Or maybe if you really did make a legitimate mistake and there was a lack of consent, you persevere in grace, you refrain from committing adultery by marrying another, you pursue a validly based annulment, and it turns out that maybe there was a lack of consent. Maybe your spouse feigned her consent. Maybe she never really intended to be bound. And that comes out, and it's legitimately proven. You get an annulment.
But what I'm referring to, Chris, and I've known some of them myself. I've got some wonderful friends, solid Catholics, who married the wrong person. There's no question about that. An alcoholic, someone who was very abusive, and they're in a terrible situation. And they get out of that situation through annulment or sometimes through a technical legal divorce for financial reasons. And those people, those solid Catholics, emerge as such exemplar Catholics because now they're going to be without. They're going to be without companionship when they're older. They can no longer have the marital life because a bad thing happened. A bad choice was made. But they don't resent the church. They don't stop being Catholics or shake their fist at God. They say, it didn't work out. I tried my best and it didn't work out. And as I say, there's where you see good coming from a bad situation. They become exemplar Catholics that people always look to and say, you know what? Catholics were never wusses or wimps or skinnying out of things, getting second chances somehow. They understood what the rules were and they played by it. And we know people that are living by those rules right now. And that's how marriage is strengthened, not by coming up with loopholes to get people, especially nowadays when there's such a little regard for marriage to begin with anymore.
Well, no one is slighting the difficulties people face in these irregular situations. But again, if you posit the notion that in a difficult situation you get an out, then morality basically becomes optional. You don't have to follow the moral, and to use that key word of the Buenos Aires bishops, you don't have to follow the moral law if it's not feasible. If you introduce the notion of feasibility into moral duty, you've destroyed moral duty wherever it becomes inconvenient. Because feasibility is a very squishy term, which in so-called pastoral application can become the rule rather than the exception. This idea of certain cases would become most cases, if not all cases. How is a pastor going to say, well, your case doesn't justify it. You can't receive Holy Communion. But the guy sitting next to you in the pew, his is more complex, so I'm going to let him receive Holy Communion. That isn't going to work. You know very well what's going to happen. And that's why the church has never allowed it to happen. There are no exceptions. And if it's difficult, if someone has to carry a heavy cross, well, all of us have been visited with crosses. And although it's easy to say that someone should follow the moral law, that it's easy to say it doesn't make it false. That's no defense that it's easy for me to say that you should follow the moral law. Of course, it's easy for me to say I'm not living in that situation. But on the flip side of that is, if it's difficult to do, you don't have to do it. That isn't the teaching of the church. That eliminates grace and turns us all into Pelagians. We save ourselves. We make our own moral solutions.
You hear so many times where especially wives seem to be more sensitive to this, where the husband wants an annulment, and she says, "Oh no, you don't. We were married, and you're not going to get an annulment." And I think again, that's the Catholic attitude. You don't take that out, even if it's not working out. It's kind of how it is in life, And I think it's just so important to recognize this. And Cardinal Burke was head of the apostolic signatura, for heaven's sakes. He's not a rad trad. He's just a solid priest, bishop, and now cardinal that had been given very recently tremendous responsibility in the governance of the church. He's not doing this to be a troublemaker. And we know what Francis is up to. We talk about for a second here, before we close, the famous telephone call to the woman in Argentina. We know what Francis wants to do. Cardinal Burke knows it too. And rather than condemning the Pope, he's asking questions. And what is the Pope doing? He's refusing to answer. What's he supposed to do with this?
He can't answer because everyone knows what he's up to. And the idea that now you don't even need to attempt an annulment, you can effectively create your own annulment by going to a priest and saying, I really don't think that first marriage is valid. And, on the internal forum, can you cut me some slack here and let me continue to have relations with my second wife because I believe she is my real wife, and the priest goes along with it. So he's basically dispensing him with the annulment process and de facto legitimating second so-called marriages as if they were valid marriages. That's what's at stake here. And that applies across the board to all moral precepts on this idea that feasibility is a defense to obedience to moral law.
It's almost like, Chris, the fact that so many Catholics now don't see this problem and aren't a little worried about it, don't see this as a potentially huge problem, the undermining of the whole entire moral law. When you don't see this problem, that's the problem. You don't see it. Because so many people now have been so watered down in their faith, they don't understand, they have been under-catechized, they don't know what it means to be Catholic, and so they look at this situation unfolding, which is sending cardinals all the way to the throne of St. Peter saying, Holiness, please answer these questions, don't do this. But we have millions of Catholics, quote-unquote neo-Catholics, going, I don't see a problem. Well, that's the problem!
That's why they call it Neo-Catholicism. It's a new form of the faith with new ideas about everything from discipline to the liturgy, and now morality. Well, it's a pastoral approach. Francis is reaching out to people who don't find it feasible to follow the moral law, and he's being merciful to them. Because if you don't let feasibility come into play in moral calculations, well, you're being rigid, like God. It's unbelievable.
Chris, I gotta let you go. It's getting late, on the time-wise, but good to see you again. It used to be we'd do these shows, and it seemed there was a little more levity, or there was going to be more fun or something. This isn't fun anymore. I mean, this is so fundamental. It's so it's depressing. It's overwhelming. The level that this problem in the church, this crisis in the church, has reached now. I don't even know. Can you come up with something positive to close us out? I can't think of what it is. So you take a crack at it.
Well, the thing that's positive about all of this is that there's just no way that he's going to succeed with this attack on the foundations of the moral order. Very few people in the Vatican, we're reading, stand by his side, only his inner circle. Everyone else, it seems, or many people in the Vatican apparatus, are murmuring against him, which accounts for his annual condemnation of the Roman Curia for their rigidity. So I think in the end, if this thing becomes established in some places, but not in others, and you end up with a fracturing of the church's discipline, sooner or later those fractures are going to be healed. It's going to take another pope, apparently. But in time, the church will heal itself, just the way it did after the Arian Crisis, when the church was fractured over an outright heresy concerning the division of Christ, the divinity of Christ. It took a subsequent council after Nicaea, the Council of Constantinople, to heal that schism in time. It took more than 60 years, but it was eventually corrected. And the bishops who had adopted the heresy professed the true faith in the end. That's going to happen inevitably. The only problem is, that's the positive note, but the negative note is the damage he's going to inflict in the meantime is incalculable, just as it was during the Arian Crisis.
I think that's exactly right. Many people have made the point, maybe we couldn't have handled another conservative pope who was, wiling and kind of inserting things more subtly. If there's one thing that Francis is not, it's subtle. And everyone can see what's going on now. It's a complete new orientation of the church, a change in the church. And I don't think actually, I really think that they're not going to get away with this. I think people are waking up. So you're right. That's the good note on which we can close out the show. So good to see you again. Let's do this again soon.
Okay, Mike. God bless.
All right. Yep. See you later. Bye-bye.